How does it happen that the greatest hitter the world of baseball's ever seen goes completely and utterly forgotten by the history books? How do scores of diehard fans just simply not know his name at all? Shoeless Joe Jackson should be up there with the other greats, like Babe Ruth and Willie Mays. Instead, baseball's biggest scandal somehow managed to ruin the World Series, destroyed several careers, and buried one of the greatest players of all time. Here's the story of the Black Sox scandal, the biggest embarrassment the game's ever faced, and the worst case of injustice and abuse against an illiterate farm boy that only ever gave them his loyalty. Joseph Jefferson Jackson was never supposed to be a superstar baseball player. He was the son of a farmer, and a poor one at that. At the ripe old age of 7 years old, he was working 12-hour shifts at the mill to help support the family. Little Joe couldn't afford shoes. He was temporarily paralyzed after nearly dying from measles at the age of 10, and he was completely illiterate. But then again, I'm guessing that there wasn't much time for a 7-year-old to do his homework after finishing a 12-hour shift at the textile mill. This was an embarrassment that Joe hid for most of his life. His wife forged his signature, and to this day, anything signed by Joe is a very low-valued collectible because, well, he rarely signed anything himself. If the team went out to dinner, Joe couldn't read the menu, so he'd wait for everyone to order and then just repeat whatever teammate's choice sounded the best. But back to Little Joe, now 12 years old. The owner of the mill placed him on the company baseball team just to fill up the numbers. The boss even paid him $2.50 every Saturday. Back in the day, that was enough money to feed the family for a whole week. But this kid, who couldn't count to 20, skinny and shy, ended up throwing a fastball so hard that it broke a teammate's arm. No one wanted to bat against him anymore. They were too afraid of the farm boy with the power arm. The coach moved him to the batter's box. And that's when this already rising little 13-year-old really came into his own. This pint-sized hitter instilled even more fear behind the bat than he did on the pitcher's mound. By the time Joe was 16, word had spread around the Carolinas and he got a paid position on an official team. It was a low-level one, but hey, everyone's got to start somewhere, right? This paycheck, as meager as it was more money than Joe'd ever seen in his life, and he was worth every penny. While he should have been finishing up high school, he already had a .346 batting average. He married a woman named Kate, and together they adopted Kate's 2 orphan nephews. Though they never had any children of their own, these 2 boys were their sons in every way that mattered. It's here that the papers started taking notice. Joe walked onto the field one day, still unable to afford shoes, took up the baseball bat barefoot and totally knocked it out of the park. The papers reported on Shoeless Joe Jackson, the wonder kid with the power arm that hailed from Carolina somewhere. Philadelphia Athletics purchased Joe's contract and put him to work in the major leagues. But Joe had a wife and kids back home, and playing ball in the big city was just too much for him to bear. He left Philadelphia, fully willing to go back to working at the mill for the rest of his life, rather than allow his kids to grow up without him. Besides, Joe wasn't walking away from much. The Philly team wasn't kind to him anyway. They made fun of his shoeless nickname, and they often mocked his inability to read and write. The world would later paint Joe as a scoundrel and a cheat, but nothing about this humble country boy was ever dishonest. Joe was a good man, decent and honest, and he was willing to turn his back on fame and fortune for his family. Don't forget that fact as we go ahead with his story and the deplorable way that he was treated for something he probably didn't do. He did go back to the major leagues in 1910, when the Cleveland Naps bought his contract. There, he ended off the year with a .387 batting average. To put that into perspective, the batting average of our guys playing professional baseball today is around 200, and Joe's been hitting above 300 since he was 16 or 17. In 1911, he was topping out above 400. Joe was like Usain Bolt on the track if Bolt were ever given steroids, before performance-enhancing drugs ever existed. He was a beast like baseball hadn't seen before. Shoeless Joe Jackson wasn't just good, he was good without being pedigree. For a guy to start baseball relatively late in childhood without any formal training, this kind of performance was unheard of, and it was all on the back of natural talent. He moved over to the Chicago White Sox in 1915, and he had some pretty amazing runs with them, including winning the World Series. But World War I drafted a lot of the baseball players in the country, putting ball on the sideline for a few years. But the men returned, and Major League Baseball continued like there was never a war to hamper their performance for most of the country. The White Sox, however, were now a mix of old and new faces, and these guys didn't get along at all. And here's where the scandal happened. To summarize what was basically the biggest scandal in baseball history, you need to understand that this game has enormous bets running off it in the background. Think of every team as a tiny little mafia family of their own, and everyone's trying to outdo another team. Only the stakes are higher because actual mob bosses, senators, and business magnates are funding teams, betting on outcomes, and powerful people have their fingers in more pies than they have any right to. Baseball's always had a dark underbelly, a lot like boxing, and 1919 to the 1940s were the worst decades for this kind of behavior. Not to mention the petty feuds between team members were the kind of stuff that Perez Hilton made his fame off of. Complete drama and a whole lot of corruption is what I'm saying. To make matters worse, the White Sox team was horribly fractured. One half of the players were paid, and the red carpet was reserved only for the media pretty boys. Others were unpaid and kept in the background during press conferences. They had no union to bargain better deals, and they couldn't leave the team once they signed up. They played together on the field well enough to make the finals in 1919, but the two groups didn't speak a word to each other unless their coaches forced them to. This was a disaster waiting to happen. Before the finals, Chick Gondal, a player on the White Sox, met with a bookie in a seedy hotel room. The terms were, throw the game and get a fat payoff. The bookie was just a middleman, the one doing the negotiating. Chick never met the guy who was paying them, but it's been long since thought to be Arnold the Brain Rothstein, kingpin of the Jewish mob up in New York and famous for rigging games from the background. Chick was definitely the main brain of the operation, but he needed to rope in as many players as he possibly could to throw the game. He convinced Eddie C. Cott, Claude Lefty Williams, Charles Swede Risberg, George Buckweaver, and Oscar Happy Felsch. True to their word, the White Sox completely fumbled the playoffs, practically handing the cup to the Cincinnati Reds. Months after the World Series, another bookie came out, accusing 8 players in the White Sox of throwing the game. If you were paying attention, I just mentioned 7 names, not 8. That's because the bookie named all these guys and Joe Jackson as the conspirators. But if you look back at Joe's stats, he never threw anything. His batting average against the Cincinnati Reds during that last game was .375, and during the World Series, he racked up 12 hits, a world record that stood until 1964. Statistically speaking, Joe performed the best on the entire team, so no, there's no physical evidence that Joe ever threw any game. But his name coming up with the bookie's tip was enough to open a huge investigation into him that ended up going through the courts. A grand jury even acquitted 3 of the named players, one of them being Joe. Look, Chick and a few others definitely threw the games, and they got paid off for it pretty handsomely. That much we know. But we can only prove that for 5 of the players overall. Buck Weaver admitted to knowing about Chick's deal. He even sat in on one of the meetings, but decided he wanted nothing to do with any of it. But he was still considered guilty simply because he didn't report on any of the illegal activities of his teammates. I completely agree that Buck's part in this was a crime, even if he didn't gain financially from it. But never was there any evidence to suggest that Joe had anything to do with it. He definitely didn't throw the game, not with stats better than anyone else in the league, and there's barely any evidence to suggest that he even knew what the others were getting into. There are 2 reasons he was under fire. First was because he signed a legal document to accept $20,000, presumably as a bribe, a document that he couldn't read at all because he was illiterate. Joe claimed that his lawyer told him the document was for something completely unrelated to a money transfer and that he had no idea what he was signing. When he woke up one day and found that he received $20,000 out of nowhere, he actually attempted to find who it belonged to in order to return the money. He was sure that this was some kind of mistake. When he couldn't find the owner of the money, he went to the owner of the White Sox and waited outside his office for hours to return the money to his boss, at least hoping that he, with more resources, would be able to find out who it belonged to. But the boss never bothered to meet with Joe, leaving him with $20,000 in his hand and no idea where it came from. And here's what I think happened. That lawyer handled most of the team's legalities. Joe was just one of many. They knew Joe couldn't read, and they probably thought he was a right old country bumpkin idiot. So they attempted to throw a bunch of red herrings around, so that if their ploy ever came out, that they'd have everyone scrambling around after nothing. or they needed to launder their money through other streams to obscure getting paid more than the league's pennies and dimes were paying them. Whatever the case, the lawyer was in on it, and poor Joe was an easy target to pile everyone else's sins onto. The fact that he went to great lengths to return money he felt didn't belong to him tells me that he was so damn pure that he probably couldn't even conceive that anyone would do such a terrible thing. Not to mention that Joe had a fantastic season behind him. He didn't throw any game. That much we can be sure of. The league banned everyone from the game for life, including the 3 that were proven innocent in a court of law. Shoeless Joe Jackson, known for being loyal to a fault, enough so that he was willing to give up a life a poor farm boy could only dream of to raise his kids right. Joe, who'd never gotten on the wrong side of any law, who was only ever humble and good to everyone, was cast out of the sport he loved based only on the word of a corrupt bookie that wanted to watch the White Sox burn. The 8 banned players have been known as the Black Sox since then, and all records of them have been banned from the Hall of Fame. Joe, arguably the greatest hitter of all time, has been denied a spot in the Hall of Fame on the basis that the league wanted to cut all of their losses to avoid a scandal. Even after a jury decided that Joe was innocent, they were willing to cut out 3 men who weren't involved, destroying their careers, yet they didn't bother to pursue the lawyer who tricked Joe into a contract that he knew full well Joe couldn't read. Luckily, Joe was a long way ahead from his mill days. It's not like he was rolling in money, because like I said, he was being grossly underpaid, another deplorable abuse of an illiterate man. But he did have a bit of savings, so he and his beloved Kate opened a dry cleaning service in Georgia for a few years. Then they moved to South Carolina, where they opened a liquor store and a restaurant. They sold the dry cleaning business and the restaurant eventually, but they ran the liquor store until the day Joe died. Joe tried for a while to get his case looked at again, hoping to return to the game he loved so much. After he turned 40, he gave up. He was past his prime, and nothing could be gained from lifting the ban now, except to allow his name into the Hall of Fame. But he didn't care about that in the slightest. He cared about Kate, his 2 sons, and baseball, not the fame or even the fortune. At the age of 56, Joe suffered a heart attack that he didn't survive. Starting in 1919, the day the scandal broke, up until the current day, fans and professional players alike have been vocal about wanting Joe's ban lifted. Lifting the ban would make him eligible to appear in the Hall of Fame, and all of his records, many of which still remain unbroken, to be accepted again. Shoeless Joe Jackson was the greatest hitter of his time and possibly the greatest hitter to ever live. Yet, this remarkable player has been all but forgotten in the long history of baseball. No one knows his name, no one counts his records, and no one recognizes his face. And why? Because a league thought it acceptable to underpay their players and to take advantage of a player that was illiterate. Both counts, in my opinion, are outright abuse. And when 5 of those underappreciated players wiped the White Sox name with their behinds, well, suddenly, they and everyone else that could tarnish the corrupt system's name any further were thrown under the bus, whether they were guilty of a crime or not. I get that the others committed a crime, even if it was a little justified. But Joe never did anything wrong. No matter how terribly the league treated him, he always remained at the top of his game and loyal to the end. Don't forget Shoeless Joe Jackson, the greatest player of all time. The sad case of Joe was just one of those titles on my docket, centered around a sport I had no interest in and names that I've never heard of. But Joe's story opened a world of underground betting, mob bosses, and deadly deceits that were worth millions. Did you know about this remarkably convoluted side of professional sports? Let me know about some of the darkest scandals that you'd like to see covered on this channel down in the comments below. Because I'm suddenly finding myself knee-deep in a new, delicious obsession of bookies and murder and crime lords all woven into the sports world. And while you're at it, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next one.